So our first keynote this morning is Diana Lind. Diana is a writer and urban policy specialist. She is currently working on a book, Brave New Home, The Smarter, Cheaper, Happier Future of Housing. And this diagnoses the current crisis in American housing and its detrimental effects on inequality, health, the environment, racial progress, community, and democracy. A graduate of Cornell University with a BA in English and Columbia University with an MFA in creative writing, Diana has held positions at Architectural Record Magazine, Rizzoli International Publications, Next City, the Philadelphia Inquirer /Philly.com, and the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of 2 books, Designing the Hamptons and Brooklyn Modern Architecture, Interiors, and Design. She also launched her own short-lived magazine, Work, in 2004, which featured writers such as Rivka Galchin and James, I'm going to butcher that, Srwalki. So it's really a pleasure, Diana, to have you here today. And I will say for both of our keynotes that they did come in rather at the last minute and so graciously just made time for us and traveled from Philadelphia and DC this morning to be with us. So Diana, if you would come up, we'll give you a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Twyla. Thank you all for having me. This is an honor, and it's a privilege to serve as your cup of coffee. For those of you who didn't have that, hopefully get you a little bit energized and get your heart beating a little bit faster, thinking about some new ideas. So as Twyla mentioned, I'm working on a book to be published next year. It's the same name as the title of my talk. And it's really exploring what I would call a mismatch between the demographics of the United States today and the housing that we have, and some of the problems that that's causing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as sort of an overview, then talk a little about some housing trends that I see that are happening nationally, and then finally talk a little bit about Pottstown. So hopefully I'll have time to get through all of that in the next 35 minutes or so. I'm going to start with a little bit of a personal anecdote and the inspiration for this book. This is my row house in Philadelphia. And before I became a mother a couple of years ago with my first child, I spent very little time at home. I would go to work. After work, I'd go to the gym, go out to dinner. I'd spend my weekends away. And then I became a mom, and the story of winter, being trapped in Manhattan, resonated with me because sort of my experience on maternity leave was sort of being trapped in winter in Philadelphia. When I had my first child, I had an infant who needed constant feeding, diapering, and attention. It was cold outside. I spent a lot of time in my house. And instead of exploring the city, I was exploring my house, my mind, and I felt, before long, pretty uncharacteristically bored, isolated, trapped. Those early months with a newborn are tough for pretty much anyone, but I couldn't help but wonder, how had humans survived, and in such quantity, if they'd always lived this way, mostly alone, each family fending for itself? And I realized, well, people hadn't always lived this way. This style of living centered around the single-family home is relatively new in the concept, in the history of mankind. So up until World War II, families traditionally lived in much more communal situations, ranging from multi-generational households to close-knit neighborhoods full of friends and family with shared identities. This is a photo from an Israeli kibbutz in 1949. So the things that I yearned for in my maternity leave, other mothers to learn from, another family to have dinner with, they were baked into living that way. Now, in 2000, a couple years ago, 2015, my options were mommy and me classes at $20 a pop and family-friendly restaurants where kids watched YouTube on their iPhones while their parents ate dinner. So out of frustration with my living situation and a lifelong fascination with cities and the built environment, I began to investigate housing choices in the United States and their economic and social and environmental consequences. So for example, I drew a clear connection between the loneliness that I experienced and the amount of time I spent at home. Did other Americans, new parents or not, share my sense of isolation at home? My husband and I, we bought a 2,600 square foot house. We spent hundreds of dollars each month on a mortgage, $300 to heat our house in the winter, $300 a month to cool the house in the summer. What were the economic and social consequences of people spending so much of their income on their housing costs and countless hours on household upkeep? If you have an old home, you know what I mean. What other kinds of trends in terms of mental or physical health, economic development, climate change, how are these all related to unaffordable and isolating housing? There's a lot of discussion about our national malaise. 1 in 8 Americans over age 12 has taken antidepressants, but most people place the blame on things like globalization, the accelerating pace of life, distracting technology. But where's the book that explores the role that homes play? Where's the book that shows how living differently could potentially strengthen our society, economy, and health? So for the past year, I've been working on writing that book, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I found. I'd always assumed that single-family homes were the way that people wanted to live, the way that I would want to live. We wouldn't have a country of cul-de-sacs if people didn't like them, right? But I found that the popularity of homeownership, whether a house with a white picket fence or a downtown loft, only partly explains its dominance. Beginning in the 1920s, the federal government subsidized suburban homeownership through a multitude of tools, such as the GI Bill, mortgage interest deduction, low borrowing rates, and building infrastructure that enabled suburban single-family development. At the same time, cities and towns began enacting zoning codes, initially intended to separate residential and commercial functions of a region, but over time, they practically outlawed housing types other than single-family housing in the vast majority of American residential areas. In addition, neighborhood associations added restrictions to minimum house sizes, lot sizes, limiting the ways that housing is used, how neighborhoods looked, and de facto who can afford to live there. Finally, as transit-rich urban density gave way to private car ownership, people could live farther and farther from a city center and farther yet from their neighbors. So over the past 75 years, Americans have been experimenting with this lifestyle around the single-family home and the privacy it creates. Each household makes its own meals, drives its own way to work and school, pays for its own internet connection, its own entertainment and news, has its own heating and cooling system, washer and dryer, plumbing and appliances. And instead of using neighborhood rec centers and pools, households buy their own toys, set up their own swing set, and so on. How's this vision of housing working out? An enduring segment of the population prides itself on achieving the financial stability that homeownership provides, and many homeowners, particularly in coastal cities, have seen their net worth rise with housing prices. Others have found that owning property grants access to financial tools like leveraging their home equity to send kids to college or pay for medical expenses. But on the other hand, the data suggests that the current housing paradigm is unaffordable, unhealthy, and out of step with consumer demand. And a growing portion of the population is unable to access the home ownership lifestyle, even if they desire it. Not surprisingly, the lack of housing choice and the prevalence of housing regulations has made housing grow more expensive decade over decade for more than a century. Since 1980, housing costs have gone up by 60%, while wages have risen only 20% on average. Now 38 million American households are housing burdened, paying more than 30% of their income on rents and mortgages. Housing affordability is a crisis, and not just in cities like New York and San Francisco. In Philadelphia, where I live, housing prices appreciated by more than 22% in 2016 alone. The collision of high prices and limited supply is most acute in these coastal cities, but extends across the country. To give just one example, in Utah, with half a dozen cities that max out at 200,000 people, they created a commission in 2018 to deal with the state's affordable housing gap. And there are plenty of desirable enclaves throughout the country, like Asheville, North Carolina, or Burlington, Vermont, where monthly rental costs rival those of major cities. Unaffordable housing is not just a problem for those who are locked out of homeownership and its benefits, it's more pernicious than that. Studies show that the high cost of housing is driving the United States, widening inequality, serving as an obstacle to economic mobility, especially for young people and minorities. Homeownership drives the country's inequality along stark racial lines. In 1950, when 89.5% of Americans classified themselves as white, minorities were legally or extra-legally prohibited from purchasing housing in many neighborhoods, further stigmatizing non-homeowners. Today, only 42.2% of African Americans are homeowners, compared with 64% of all Americans and 72% of whites. While redlining is now officially illegal, its legacy remains. Even in majority Black cities, there's a double-digit gap between Black and white homeownership rates. Given that homeownership is a significant conduit to growing wealth in this country, the resulting economic disparities are inevitable. Unaffordable housing also comes with serious mental and physical health ramifications. Just a few examples. A study by Yale University researchers found that poor families paying more than 50% of their income on rent were more likely to skimp on food and medical attention than families with similar incomes who spent 30% or less of their income on housing. Another study examined the health effects of the 2008 foreclosure crisis and found that experiencing a foreclosure, even living near foreclosures, was associated with elevated levels of anxiety, depression, and violent behavior. And there are also adverse health effects associated with single-family suburbanization, including lower rates of walking and social interaction. Loneliness is being called the new health epidemic of our times, apparently as bad for you as smoking cigarettes or being obese. And significantly, this pattern of development has increased the country's per capita carbon emissions. With each family owning an average of 1.4 cars, and as Americans occupy ever more square footage requiring heating and cooling, single-family houses contribute an outsized share to the world's climate change crisis. At the same time that the housing crisis has become acute, American demographics and social norms have shifted dramatically, even though many of our institutions haven't kept pace. Consider that at the turn of the 20th century, most adults were married, a minuscule percentage were divorced, and the average family had 4 children. These demographics strongly influenced the housing boom in the 1950s. I wanted to just make sure I got a couple of these statistics correct. Today, the dominance of white heteronormative families have given way to a much more diverse country. Those born in the US since 2011 have been majority minority. The average age of first marriage has grown from early 20s in the 1960s to late 20s today. While the rate of divorce peaked in the 1990s, still nearly half of marriages don't work out. Today's average family is just 3.14 people, including children, and nearly 60% of first-time home buyers have no children. Average life expectancy is near 80, gaining a decade in the past half-century, and the average household size keeps going down, with some 28% of Americans now living alone. These are just the demographics of today. Imagine the world the next generation will inhabit. Americans' daily life and preferences have also changed, whether by choice or by force, to become more virtual, more mobile, and less stable. A society designed around cars is giving way to a love of ride-hailing apps and walkable neighborhoods. Our television habit has morphed into phone addiction. Single-earner households have turned into dual-earner households. Steady jobs with daily commutes have declined, while the gig economy, working remotely, and even a rootless digital nomadism have taken hold. Freelancers currently make up 1/3 of the country's workforce and are expected to become the majority in the next decade. Augmented reality and driverless cars are bound to shake up physical and social contours even more. But housing still looks largely the same as it did in 1950. Granted, architecture has a certain permanence literally built into it, but even brand new developments are full of 2,500 square foot houses with 2-car garages. As so much of American life has changed, why hasn't housing? Homeowners, developers, and local governments are deeply invested in maintaining the status quo, both for their financial benefit and in some sense to cope with fast-moving social change. Homeowners are deeply protective of what is often their greatest financial asset and investment. Real estate developers are risk-averse and therefore build what has proven popular in the past. Government, from the federal level to the local level, has endorsed a homeowner-oriented policy for a century and views homeownership as a critical element in creating clean and safe neighborhoods. Since renters tend to be from more diverse backgrounds and have lower incomes, promoting homeownership is often a way for local entities to skew whiter and wealthier without practicing overt or illegal discrimination. But these vested constituents are fighting a different kind of climate change. In the 21st century, where everything from dating to currency has gone digital, where fewer people can afford homes, where minorities are fighting against discriminatory policies, and millennials don't want ownership models or expect stability, housing is bound to change too. This confluence of factors is galvanizing an unlikely coalition of priced-out would-be homeowners, architects, developers, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, and progressive politicians who are pushing for new forms of housing and policies that can encourage their adoptions. We're beginning to see change in government. Look at Minneapolis, which, as part of its 2040 plan, ended its single-family housing zoning. Instead, all properties citywide, de facto, can be used or built as triplexes. Other cities are looking to follow suit. And we're seeing change in the marketplace. And so I'll just be talking in a few moments about 3 segments of the market: co-living, accessory dwelling units, and multi-generational housing. These are 3 trends that I see really changing housing dynamics. Whether public, private, or civic, housing investors are growing frustrated with the existing paradigm, and so they're up for trying something new. So I'm going to first start talking about co-living. Who here has heard of co-living before, just out of curiosity? Okay, a decent number of people. But I thought I would start with just sort of a description. And the best way to describe co-living is perhaps to start with the term co-working. So, I'm sure if I asked who knows what co-working is, everyone would raise their hands. We used to have dreary office spaces painted white with gray carpet, where in order to rent an office, you had to sign a lease for a year. You had to pay for 5 different bills separately. The entire enterprise of the office building was set up around large established businesses who had the longevity and capital to sign multi-year leases for large square footage. It was as if small businesses didn't exist, despite the fact that there are some 58.9 million small business employees in the United States. So I use this as sort of a way to start thinking about how there are these almost hidden demographics that are hidden by our sort of institutions and the way that we sort of continue with the status quo, as if there weren't 60 million people who were in small businesses. So WeWork smartly realized that the conventional office rental situation didn't work for most small businesses, particularly those with fewer than 10 employees. Aside from streamlining the office setup and making rent all-inclusive, WeWork also realized that people didn't need huge offices or want tons of privacy. In fact, their customer would be content to work in a phone booth-sized office space so long as she's surrounded by interesting people, chic furnishings, free beer, a barista handing out cappuccinos. So, smart idea. WeWork, it's worth $40 billion now. And the WeWork has gone into co-living as WeLive, as have a number of co-living companies. And they're taking these ideas essentially to housing. So this is a picture from WeLive in Wall Street. And it looks very similar to that sort of WeWork situation. Many people, particularly young people, want activities after work, a nicely furnished living room, interesting housemates, occasional visitors, and outsourced housework. And they're willing to pay a premium in money, privacy, or space for these amenities. One of the drivers of this change is clear enough. Personal and professional life has become more and more digital, and people crave in-person interaction more. As the average household size shrinks closer to one person, Americans aren't always finding that interaction easy. We know instinctively that the quantity and quality of social relationships affect our mental health, our behavior, and even our mortality risk. But studies have shown that people with strong social ties and unhealthy habits like smoking, drinking, and obesity actually exhibit lower mortality rates than those without strong social ties. Demographics and dollars also explain the allure of co-living. 77 million Americans born between 1980 and 2000, millennials, are waiting longer to get married and buying fewer homes. Just 31% of millennials own homes compared to the 64% of people nationally. There's no single explanation for this shift, but certainly the brokenness of millennials plays a big part. Only 22% of millennials are debt-free, and 11% owe more than $100,000, which puts home ownership out of reach for many young people. Marriage before 30 is increasingly rare. Across the country, the share of households aged 20 to 34 that were married was just 37% in 2017, dropping from 45% as recently as 2000. The latest crop of young adults may not be getting married or buying real estate, but nonetheless, this demographic wants high-quality housing and social experiences. An Instagram feed showing people living their so-called best life raises the bar not just for weekend activities, but for the mundane aspects of bedroom decor and meal prep. Co-living, which also often comes with stylish furniture, communal meals in dramatically sized dining rooms, and amenities like yoga classes or nightly activities, offer young people something akin to what H&M does for clothes or Uber does for transportation. It's a proxy for luxury at lower cost. You may be saying, well, will this work in Pottstown? It's coming to Philadelphia, which to me is an indicator of something that a model that could work much around the rest of the country. So there are two co-living projects in the works in Philadelphia. One is Common, the other is called Quarters. Also, Ollie, another company that I profile in my book, launched their first community in Pittsburgh. And so while Pottstown is obviously smaller than Philly or Pittsburgh, I have heard a lot of references to how it's like Phoenixville, which has now 2 small co-working spaces. And you can kind of see the trends here, co-working to co-living. I can also say that I started following co-living about a year ago, where people were getting really excited about co-living operators getting $20 million in investment. Now they're getting $100 million, $200 million, $400 million. So it's a trend that has legs. You might also say we don't have tons of affluent young people who would be interested in this kind of living, but there's a lot of other demographics who this appeals to. So that full third of Americans who are working on a freelance basis, people over 50 who want housing that can flex through a job shift, a divorce, or a next phase of life. Co-living can be more flexible for that. Finally, governments are starting to get on board. New York's planning office is developing a prototype for affordable shared living and how zoning and other regulations can be adapted for it. Philadelphia is exploring zoning reform to make single-room occupancy legal, to bring also hundreds of units out of the shadows and under regulation for health and safety. New Orleans is developing a 233-unit co-living project aimed at the city's service workers, where the city will exchange a tax break for freezing rents. So there's a lot of ways in which governments can get involved. And so there's a lot of different types of co-living. Could end up being something quite different than what we're seeing today. My guess is that co-living, shared living in general, will start to work for different budgets and different kinds of people as shared living becomes destigmatized a bit. So the next trend that I'm going to talk about is small-scale housing, best known as tiny houses. So you may have seen some tiny houses on HGTV, which has not one but two television shows about tiny houses, and they pitch this as a, quote, daydream for most people, but the intrepid folk who live in itty-bitty homes have a thing or two to teach the rest of us about living the good life and making the most of what we've got. So the reality of tiny homes is a lot less like the HGTV vision, but it's often an economical way for people to live in under 300 square feet. As I talked about, both market and government forces have really pushed up housing size, but people are fighting back, especially as they're finding that they really can't afford more than 200 to 300 square feet. City governments from Seattle to Detroit are employing tiny houses as a solution to the affordable housing crisis, while others, like Nashville, see them as a way of retaining millennials who would otherwise be priced out of the city. There's this particular house here, and there's an interesting quote in this article about how millennials don't care about big houses, they care more about their environmental footprint. So it works both for people who are interested in small housing by choice and small housing by need. Another big trend that we're seeing are accessory dwelling units, where people are using tiny houses either as a primary residence or as potentially an Airbnb, a place to host extended family. And so cities from Los Angeles to Portland to Philadelphia are promoting now their multiple benefits: affordability, allowing for extended family to live closely with privacy, and additional income. ADUs also provide more than just housing, but a way to achieve density that can support transit and a stronger tax base. Some local governments are also promoting ADUs, these accessory dwelling units, as a compromise, a way to grow the city's population and housing stock without fundamentally altering the suburban character of its neighborhoods. Also interesting, and sort of going along with some of these trends, ADUs are pretty tech compatible, so 3D printing, prefabrication, and inexpensive customization, these are all big trends in housing, and they're making housing more accessible to the masses. So I would bet that in a decade, ordering a home online is going to be a lot more easy. Companies like New Story and Icon have garnered attention for 3D printing small houses for $10,000. That could be a game changer, not just for affordable housing for cities, but for disaster recovery and so on. Across the West Coast, states like California and Washington have loosened their regulations on accessory dwelling units. There have been a lot of regulations like requiring a separate parking space for housing, requiring a certain housing size, or that even a homeowner have lived in a particular location for something like 5 years, and they're just making it easier to build ADUs. The result has been a flood of backyard cottages. I was talking with the innovation director of Los Angeles recently. She talked about how in 2 years, pre and post reforming ADU regulations at the state, they've seen an 1,000% increase in permit applications. This doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to end up seeing a lot of affordable housing, because a lot of people are looking at this, again, as a potential income stream. But cities are starting to look at how could we potentially incentivize and support homeowners to build accessory dwelling units and rent them to below medium income residents. So this is an article from the Times about a project going on in LA where the city is partnering to help make it easier to navigate the tricky process of becoming a developer and a landlord. This is a pretty radical change in how we view the American dream. Monetize the excess capacity of your property, potentially living closer with extended family, or finding a way to live on your property within for many different stages of your life. So finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about multi-generational housing. In 2016, some 64 million Americans, 20% of the country, lived multi-generationally. It's the highest percentage since 1950, and it's partly this trend that is pushing the interest in ADUs. What's going on? There are 5 main factors that the nonprofit Generations United has pointed to. Some of which I've already discussed, the fact that people are marrying later, that we are seeing a much higher immigration population, that there are economic needs. And when I spoke to the executive director of Generations United, she explained to me that a good way of thinking about this is that people come together out of need, but are staying together by choice. And there's also this increasing trend overall of adults sharing housing, where it's not just kids moving back with their parents, but parents moving in with their children. I've seen research pointing to other demographics, fragments like older educated single mothers living with parents, families dealing with opioid addiction, all coming under the same roof. There are a few market leaders in this space. One of them is Lennar Homes, which developed a model called Next Gen. It's essentially a regular house with an apartment attached. It's kind of actually like a house with an ADU right attached next to it. And it sort of reinforces what I'm talking about. In the Times, they mentioned a decade ago, a dream home was designed to wow your friends and neighbors. Today, it's designed to house your relatives, your Airbnb guests, be your workplace. Home builders say one of the biggest selling points in 2018 isn't a 3-car garage or grand entryway, it's a home with flexibility. So while more people live multi-generationally than do in ADUs or co-living, this trend is getting a lot less policy attention, less market interest, less media attention. And that's partly because from the outside, and even sometimes from the inside, multi-generational housing looks a lot like regular housing. But it's sometimes the smallest changes that make the biggest differences. So for example, if a house doesn't have a bedroom and a full bathroom on the first floor, it's unlikely that a grandparent would choose to live there. But there's many reasons why we should care about multi-generational housing. We're facing at the same time the retirement and aging of baby boomers at the same time as we're seeing a young generation that can't afford home ownership. So it makes a lot of sense that we would find multi-generational households in this context. At the same time, we also find the sort of non-millennial population is involved in some kind of caretaking role, whether it's taking care of kids or taking care of parents. And the related stress of caretaking is having a toll on finances, time, and health. So how could multi-generational housing play a solution for these issues? We really, in fact, have to start looking to other countries rather than to examples that we can find in our own country. Just a couple of examples. Germany not only supports multi-generational houses, but has created 540 they're multi-generational houses that combines kindergarten and senior support services. Birmingham in the United Kingdom has noted that seniors lived in houses that were much too big for them, and so their housing agency has been building small 2-story houses where everything you need is on the first floor, but that upper floor is geared towards housing younger relatives, a live-in aid, so on. Singapore identifies multi-generational housing as its own housing type and attaches subsidies to it. And it will even incentivize and subsidize older adults living with their elderly parents. So as statistics show, people are moving in together naturally without help from government or private sector projects. But I think we should be thinking about how could we be living together, how could we be supporting people who need to live together or want to live together with a better living situation. So all of these innovations suggest that there's a growing demand for the alternatives to the current models here in the US. Many people would prefer to break bread with neighbors than eat alone in a formal dining room. People would prefer an income stream rather than a picket fence. And for some people, having made it means having a nice Instagram feed more than owning a home. But what's exciting about these housing options is that they may not only better meet the cultural needs of people today, but could make housing more affordable. And they can do that without raising taxes. They can do it in a way where they're less exclusive but not downgrading neighborhoods or ghettoizing affordable housing in some kind of separate community. So where does this leave Pottstown? I don't have the answers, but I do have a lot of questions that I hope that you might think about. I would start by thinking about how zoning kind of implicitly privileges one kind of housing over another. So if your default residential zoning is a single-family home, how much harder is it then to be building multifamily housing? How would your housing stock potentially be more affordable if there were multiple property types available? And how are developers potentially discouraged from creating other types of quality housing by simply prioritizing single-family homes? I would also ask, in prioritizing home ownership as sort of a philosophy, what other opportunities might you be missing out on to support income growth, wealth growth in your community? So are there better ways to cater to the demographics of the area by supporting other types of housing? Are there ways that opportunities for accessory dwelling units that could serve as income properties? Are there ways to support people moving in together if that is part of their culture or a way to essentially support their finances? So intertwined with these questions of housing is the question of, what is the good life? What does a good community look like? What is good development? And I would sort of challenge you as you think about these questions, think about kind of where some of our old preconceptions are around things like shared living, living with relatives, smaller homes. Are these sort of stigmas that we carry around because they're valid, or are they sort of things that we just carry with us because that's the way that the United States has been running for the past 75 years. As I mentioned, with all those different social changes that we've been going through as a country, this, I think, is one where it's taken a long time to actually see how housing could potentially evolve, but it's ripe for disruption. So I'll end with a quote that I think about a lot. In interviewing one of the co-founders of a co-living company, Ollie, talked to this guy, Chris Bledsoe, and he said, "Housing has already been disrupted. The world just doesn't know it yet. Because if you're lucky, this is a product," he's talking about co-living, "that takes 3 or 4 years to bring to market. So what we'll see 4 years from now is merely a reflection of where we are today, and what we'll see in 4 years after that, that's what's really exciting." So think about, if you're investing in Pottstown, think about not just investing in Pottstown for 2019 or even 2023. Think about, 4 years after that. What does it look like a decade from now? And I would urge you to think about some of these demographic trends and where we'll be as a country in the next decade, and really think about how to develop your community with that future in mind. So, thank you.